Gold does not usually possess a voice, metal does not speak, and silver does not accuse. And yet in the long record of sacred history there are objects that seem to carry within them the weight of the divine, waiting silently for the moment they will be called to testify. In the year 539 before Christ, within the colossal walls of a city that believed itself eternal, 1,000 lords lifted their cups beneath the glow of 1,000 lamps. And somewhere in that golden light, judgment was already walking toward them. The city was Babylon, and on this particular night the wine flowed freely from vessels that were never meant to touch a common table. These were not ordinary cups. They were the consecrated instruments of the temple of the living God, plundered decades earlier from the sacred halls of Jerusalem, carried in triumph to a foreign land, and locked away as trophies of a war fought, or so the conquerors believed, between the God of Israel and the gods of Babylon. Tonight, a king would drink from them, and that single decision made in a moment of drunken bravado would become one of the most chilling encounters between heaven and earth recorded anywhere in Scripture. This is the story of the Feast of Belshazzar, the story of the finger of God on the wall. It is not simply a tale of a party gone wrong. It is a profound meditation on what happens when human pride finally exhausts the patience of heaven, when a soul that has been warned again and again chooses, one final time, to look away. It is the story of a phrase that has entered nearly every language on earth. The writing is on the wall, a phrase people use today with little memory of the terror from which it was born. To understand why a disembodied hand once appeared in the middle of a royal banquet and reduced the most powerful man on earth to a trembling wreck, we must set aside the wine and the silk, the lamps and the laughter, and look instead at the anatomy of a heart that refused again and again to remember. Welcome to Heaven's Scroll, where we unroll the ancient mysteries of the Word. To understand the night the hand appeared, we first have to understand the empire that made such arrogance possible. By the time of our story, Babylon was not merely a city. It was the beating heart of the ancient world, the capital of an empire so vast, so wealthy, and so seemingly unshakable that its citizens had begun to speak of it as though it were permanent, as though history itself had reached its final resting place within its walls. Ancient historians describe fortifications of staggering scale, walls so thick that chariots could reportedly pass one another along the top, gates of bronze reinforced against every conceivable siege, and hanging terraces of green that seemed to defy the surrounding desert. Whatever the precise truth behind these ancient descriptions, and modern archaeology suggests some of these figures were exaggerated by later writers awed by the city's memory, the underlying reality is not in question. Babylon, in the 6th century before Christ, was the closest thing the ancient world had to an unconquerable city, and its people believed it. This empire had not been built by Belshazzar. It had been built in large part by a man named Nebuchadnezzar, arguably the most powerful monarch of his age, a conqueror who had subdued nations, reshaped the map of the Near East, and, most significantly for our story, brought the kingdom of Judah to its knees. It was Nebuchadnezzar's armies that had marched against Jerusalem, breached its walls, burned the Temple of Solomon to the ground, and carried its sacred vessels of gold and silver back to Babylon as spoils of war. It was Nebuchadnezzar's decree that had sent thousands of Israelites into exile, weeping by the rivers of Babylon, as the psalmist so hauntingly recorded, unable to sing the songs of Zion in a strange and foreign land. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn, one that later generations, and especially the man who would inherit Nebuchadnezzar's throne, chose to conveniently forget. Nebuchadnezzar, for all his power, was not left unanswered by the God whose temple he had destroyed. The book of Daniel, in its 4th chapter, records an extraordinary episode in which the great king, at the very height of his glory, standing upon the roof of his palace and admiring the empire he had built with his own hands, was struck by a divine judgment so severe that he was driven from human society altogether. According to the scripture, Nebuchadnezzar's mind was taken from him. He lived among the beasts of the field, ate grass like an ox, and allowed his hair to grow like the feathers of eagles, and his nails like the claws of birds, until, as the text tells us, 7 times passed over him. This was not madness in the sense of random misfortune. It was, according to the biblical account, a direct and deliberate act of divine humbling, designed to teach the king of Babylon a lesson no army had been able to teach him, that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he will. And remarkably, at the end of this ordeal, when Nebuchadnezzar's understanding returned to him, Scripture records that he lifted his eyes to heaven, blessed the Most High, and was restored to his throne with even greater honor than before. He became, in his final recorded words in Scripture, a man who praised and extolled and honored the King of Heaven, all of whose works are truth and his ways justice, and those who walk in pride he is able to put down. This is the family legacy Belshazzar inherited, not merely gold and armies and a throne of ivory, but a living, breathing testimony delivered by his own ancestor that the God of the Hebrews was not a defeated deity to be mocked, but the sovereign ruler of history itself, a God who could reach into the mind of the most powerful man alive and humble him in an afternoon. And this is precisely what makes the events about to unfold so devastating. Because Belshazzar knew, he was not ignorant of what had happened. He had grown up in the shadow of this story. It was not ancient history to him, it was family history. And as we shall see, sacred history offers other examples of what happens when an inherited faith, a borrowed reverence never made personal, collapses the moment convenient circumstances arise. Scripture elsewhere tells of King Joash of Judah, a ruler who walked faithfully only as long as the godly priest who mentored him remained alive, and who abandoned that faith the moment his mentor was gone. The pattern is a sobering one, repeated again and again throughout the biblical record, a devotion that is propped up by another person's righteousness rather than rooted in one's own conviction, rarely survives the removal of that support. Now let us address a detail that has long fascinated both theologians and historians, because it matters for understanding exactly who Belshazzar was and why he behaved the way he did on that fateful night. Daniel chapter 5 repeatedly refers to Belshazzar as the son of Nebuchadnezzar, yet historical and archaeological evidence, most notably an ancient artifact known as the Nabonidus cylinder, tells us that Belshazzar's actual father was a king named Nabonidus, not Nebuchadnezzar at all. So how do we reconcile scripture with history? The answer lies in the flexibility of ancient Semitic language. In Hebrew and Aramaic usage, the word for son was frequently applied to any successor, descendant, or heir to a throne, regardless of direct biological lineage. It is entirely possible, and many historians consider it likely, that Belshazzar was Nebuchadnezzar's grandson through his mother, making him a legitimate dynastic heir, even though Nabonidus, his actual father, was not related to Nebuchadnezzar by blood. Scripture's use of son, then, is not an error. It is simply an accurate reflection of ancient royal terminology, one that establishes Belshazzar's place within the covenant story of judgment and mercy that had already been written across his family's history. There is more the historical record tells us, and it enriches our understanding of the feast itself. King Nabonidus, Belshazzar's father, was, by all accounts, an unusual and somewhat reclusive monarch, deeply devoted to the moon god Sin, rather than Babylon's traditional patron deity Marduk, a religious preference that made him unpopular with the powerful priesthood of the capital. For reasons historians still debate, Nabonidus spent long periods of his reign away from Babylon altogether, residing for roughly a decade in the distant Arabian oasis of Tamar. During this extended absence, it was Belshazzar, his son, who ruled Babylon in his place as co-regent, exercising royal authority even though he never held the full title of king in his own right. This historical detail explains a puzzling feature of Daniel chapter 5 that has troubled careful readers for centuries. When Daniel successfully interprets the writing on the wall, Belshazzar can only offer him the position of third ruler in the kingdom rather than second. The reason is now clear. Belshazzar himself was only the second highest authority in Babylon, his father Nabonidus still technically holding the throne. Third place was, quite literally, the highest honor Belshazzar had the power to bestow. This is precisely the kind of small, seemingly incidental detail that skeptics once used to question the accuracy of the book of Daniel, and precisely the kind of detail that archaeology has since triumphantly confirmed. Far from undermining the biblical account, history has vindicated it in remarkable and unexpected ways. Now we come to the night itself and the desperate, defiant atmosphere in which it unfolded. By 539 before Christ, the mighty Babylonian Empire was no longer secure. Outside its legendary walls, a coalition army under the command of the Persian ruler Cyrus the Great, whose forces included the Medes, had been advancing for years, absorbing kingdom after kingdom, until finally they stood encamped against Babylon itself. The siege had begun. And yet inside the city, behind those impregnable fortifications, there was, by most accounts, an almost surreal sense of calm, even complacency. The Babylonians believed their walls could never be breached, that their granaries held enough food to withstand a siege of years, that the river Euphrates, flowing directly through the heart of their city, guaranteed them an endless supply of water no enemy could ever cut off. It is against this backdrop of a city under siege, yet drunk on its own sense of invincibility, that King Belshazzar made his most fateful decision. Rather than calling his people to fasting, to prayer, to sober military strategy in the face of an approaching army, Belshazzar summoned 1,000 of his lords to a lavish banquet. Scripture tells us plainly in Daniel chapter 5 that while he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave a command. He ordered that the golden and silver vessels which his predecessor Nebuchadnezzar had carried out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought before him, so that the king, his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Pause here and consider the sheer audacity of that command. These were not ordinary artifacts to be casually repurposed as party favors. They were the sacred instruments of worship dedicated to the God of Israel, vessels set apart, consecrated, holy in the truest biblical sense of that word, meaning separated entirely for divine use and forbidden from common purposes. To drink casual toasts from them at a drunken feast, celebrating the very gods of Babylon while doing so, was not simply poor judgment. It was, in the language of Scripture, a direct and calculated act of blasphemy, a formal statement declaring that the God of the Hebrews had been utterly and finally defeated by the gods of Babylon, gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone, as the text specifically records the king and his court praising that very night. In the moral vocabulary of the Bible, this act represents something far deeper than mere disrespect. It is the ultimate expression of ingratitude, the deliberate forgetting of mercy once shown. Just as Joash, in an earlier chapter of Israel's story, forgot the kindness of the priest who had saved his very life as a child, Belshazzar chose to forget the mercy God had shown his own family, the humbling and subsequent restoration of Nebuchadnezzar, a story he had grown up hearing, perhaps even from the lips of the man who lived it. He took what was sacred and made it profane, and in doing so, according to the ancient biblical principle that God's holiness cannot be indefinitely mocked without consequence, he invited a reckoning that had, quite literally, already been written. And then, in the very same hour, something happened that no one in that banqueting hall could have anticipated. Scripture describes it with an almost unbearable simplicity. Fingers of a man's hand appeared and began to write on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, directly opposite the lampstand, in full view of the entire assembly. Consider that detail for a moment, because it is far from incidental. The light by which this terrifying vision was illuminated came from the very lampstands that, by every reasonable historical assumption, may have themselves been taken from the temple treasury, part of the same collection of sacred vessels desecrated that night. The instruments of holy worship were, quite possibly, providing the light by which divine judgment was written against the very men who had defiled them. It is difficult to imagine a more fitting, more poetically devastating image of justice in the entire Old Testament. The reaction of the king is described with almost cinematic, visceral detail. His face changed color. His thoughts terrified him so deeply that, as the text records with startling physical honesty, the joints of his hips gave way and his knees knocked together. This was not a subtle shift in mood. This was the complete physical collapse of a man who, moments earlier, had been the unquestioned ruler of the known world, now reduced by 4 words on a wall to a trembling, terrified figure unable to control his own body. Belshazzar immediately called for his enchanters, his astrologers, and his diviners of omens, the professional class of Babylonian wise men whose entire reputation rested on their supposed ability to interpret signs and mysteries. He offered them extraordinary rewards, promising that whoever could read the writing and explain its meaning would be clothed in purple, adorned with a chain of gold around his neck, and elevated to the 3rd highest position in the entire kingdom. And yet, despite everything these men claimed to know, despite their years of study and their reputations for supernatural insight, not one of them could read the words, let alone explain what they meant. Their wisdom, so confidently paraded before the king on ordinary days, proved utterly hollow the moment it was confronted with the actual, undeniable presence of the divine. It is a pattern that echoes throughout Scripture, from the powerless priests of Baal on Mount Carmel to the counselors who once flattered and misled the young King Joash. Human wisdom, divorced from genuine reverence for God, consistently collapses at the precise moment it is needed most. The king's terror only deepened as his lords, too, were greatly troubled, and the entire banquet, moments earlier alive with music and laughter, descended into chaos and dread. It was at this critical moment that an unexpected figure entered the story. One whose intervention would ultimately save the situation from complete despair, even if it could not save the kingdom itself. The queen, likely the Queen Mother, someone with long memory of the royal court's history, perhaps Nebuchadnezzar's own widow or daughter, entered the banqueting hall upon hearing of the commotion. And she reminded the panicked king of a man who had evidently been forgotten by the current administration, a man who had served with distinction in previous reigns, but whose reputation had apparently faded from the immediate memory of the younger king. "There is a man in your kingdom," she told Belshazzar, "in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him." She went on to describe how Nebuchadnezzar himself had once appointed this man chief over all the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners of Babylon, because of his extraordinary spirit, knowledge, and understanding, his remarkable ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems that baffled everyone else. The man's name, she said, was Daniel. By this point in the biblical narrative, Daniel was almost certainly an elderly man, likely somewhere in his 80s, a living relic of an era that had already passed. He had first been brought to Babylon as a young captive during Nebuchadnezzar's earliest campaigns against Jerusalem, decades before this feast, and had risen to remarkable prominence under that king's reign, only to apparently fade from the political spotlight under the subsequent administration of Nabonidus and Belshazzar. He stands, in many ways, as a bookend figure spanning the entire arc of the Babylonian exile, present at its beginning and now, unexpectedly, present again at its dramatic and sudden end. Daniel was brought before the king, and what follows is one of the most striking confrontations between prophet and monarch found anywhere in Scripture. Belshazzar, still visibly shaken, offered Daniel the same rewards promised to the failed wise men: royal purple robes, a golden chain, the position of third ruler in the kingdom. Daniel's response is remarkable for its complete indifference to earthly reward, at the very moment when such reward was being dangled before him by the most powerful man in the world. "Let your gifts be for yourself," Daniel told the king, "and give your rewards to another." He would speak the truth regardless of what it cost him or what it might have earned him. Prophetic integrity, unmoved by either fear or flattery, stands here in sharp and deliberate contrast to the hollow flattery so often offered by court advisors throughout biblical history. Before Daniel ever addressed the writing on the wall, he did something the king almost certainly did not expect and probably did not welcome. He delivered a history lesson, and a deeply uncomfortable one. He recounted in detail the story of Nebuchadnezzar's own pride, his boasting in his own power and glory, and the divine judgment that had stripped him of his sanity and his throne, until he acknowledged, in Daniel's own words, that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he wishes. And then Daniel turned the full weight of this history directly toward the trembling king standing before him. "But you, his successor, O Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this." This single sentence is, in many respects, the theological center of the entire narrative. Belshazzar was not condemned for ignorance. He was condemned precisely because he knew. He had access to the full testimony of what God had done to his own predecessor. A testimony he could have learned from first hand, and he chose, deliberately and repeatedly, to disregard it, to lift himself up against the Lord of heaven, to bring out the sacred vessels of God's temple and use them for drunken revelry while praising gods that, in Daniel's own blunt assessment, do not see or hear or know, lifeless idols of metal and stone. Meanwhile, Daniel pointedly reminded him he had failed to honor the God in whose hand is your breath and whose are all your ways. Only now, having laid this foundation, did Daniel turn to the writing itself and reveal its meaning, word by devastating word. Mene, he explained, meant that God had numbered the days of Belshazzar's kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel meant that the king had been weighed on the scales and found wanting, his life and reign measured against the standard of divine justice and found insufficient. And Peres, related to the word for divided, meant that his kingdom would be divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians, the very army even then encamped outside the city walls. Scholars have long noted a striking wordplay embedded in the original Aramaic, since the term for the coin mina and the verb numbered share a root, as do the terms shekel and weighed, and remarkably, the word rendered divided also sounds strikingly similar to Persia itself, a subtle linguistic dagger embedded within the very announcement of the empire's downfall. What happened next unfolded with almost unbelievable speed. Belshazzar, true to his word despite everything he had just heard, commanded that Daniel be clothed in purple, that a golden chain be placed around his neck, and that he be proclaimed third ruler in the kingdom, an honor bestowed in the very same breath as a sentence of doom. That very night, Scripture records with stark and unadorned finality, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. The fall of Babylon that night is one of the most dramatic reversals in ancient history, and extra-biblical historical sources add remarkable color to the biblical account, even though these details are not found within Scripture itself. The Greek historians Herodotus and Xenophon, writing generations later, recorded that the Persian and Median forces achieved their stunning victory not through a direct frontal assault on Babylon's famous walls, but through remarkable ingenuity. According to these ancient historians, the invading army diverted the waters of the Euphrates River into an artificial basin upstream, temporarily lowering the water level enough that soldiers could wade beneath the city's fortifications along the very riverbed that normally protected it, entering the city almost entirely undetected, while the feast, according to these same historical traditions, roared on obliviously inside. Whether or not every detail of this account is precisely accurate, and historians continue to debate its finer points, the underlying reality is beyond dispute. The city that believed itself impregnable fell in a single night, its supposedly invincible walls rendered utterly useless, exactly as the writing on the wall had foretold only hours earlier. And here we arrive at a connection that deepens the theological weight of this entire narrative immeasurably. This was not simply an unfortunate military defeat suffered by an unlucky king. It was the direct fulfillment of prophecy spoken generations before Belshazzar was even born. The prophet Isaiah, writing more than a century earlier, had spoken with astonishing specificity about the eventual fall of Babylon, describing a coming destruction so complete that the city would become like Sodom and Gomorrah, never again inhabited. Remarkably, Isaiah had even named the specific instrument of God's judgment by name, decades before that man was born, calling Cyrus by name and describing him as God's shepherd and anointed, the one who would fulfill all of God's purpose against Babylon and permit the exiled Israelites to return home and rebuild their temple. The prophet Jeremiah, too, had foretold that Babylon's dominance would last a specific and limited period, 70 years, after which judgment would fall upon the empire that had once seemed eternal. The events of that single terrifying night at Belshazzar's feast represent the precise historical fulfillment of prophecies spoken by God's servants long before any human being could have predicted the specific circumstances of Babylon's collapse. This is one of the most powerful demonstrations in the entire Old Testament of the sovereignty of God over the rise and fall of nations, a theme woven throughout the book of Daniel and confirmed dramatically in this single catastrophic evening. There is a broader thread connecting this Old Testament account to the New Testament that deserves careful reflection as well. The image of being weighed in the balances resonates throughout Scripture as a symbol of divine judgment, an assessment of a life or a kingdom against the perfect standard of God's justice, a theme that reappears in various forms throughout the prophetic and wisdom literature and echoes even into the imagery of final judgment found in the New Testament book of Revelation, where the great and prideful city of Babylon is again symbolically judged and cast down for its excess, its idolatry, and its blasphemous use of what is holy. Ancient Babylon's fall became, for later biblical writers, a template and a warning, a historical event so theologically rich that it was drawn upon again and again as a symbol of pride confronted by divine justice. What then does the fall of Belshazzar teach us across the centuries? First, it teaches that no fortress, however legendary, however seemingly impregnable, can ultimately withstand the judgment of God when a nation or a soul crosses the boundary of his patience. The walls of Babylon, celebrated throughout the ancient world for their impossible thickness and height, could not keep out a single disembodied hand, and they could not, in the end, keep out the army that would topple the entire empire in a single night. Second, it stands as a permanent warning against the danger of an inherited faith that is never made personal. Belshazzar did not lack access to the truth. He possessed, quite literally, a living family testimony to the power and mercy of the God of Israel, a testimony written in his own grandfather's transformation from a beast of the field back into a humbled and worshipful king. And yet Belshazzar lived, as it were, on the fumes of someone else's encounter with God, never allowing that truth to take root in his own heart until those borrowed fumes finally ran out, and he was left with nothing but pride, wine, and the sacred vessels of a God he had chosen never to truly know. Third, and perhaps most sobering of all, this story reminds us that God takes notice of how his holy things are treated, and how the innocent suffering of his people, exiled and displaced by the very man whose vessels were now being desecrated, is not forgotten by heaven, even when it appears for a time that arrogance and power have won the day. The temple vessels defiled that night were in time restored. History records that Cyrus, the very king whose forces conquered Babylon that evening, issued a decree permitting the exiled Jewish people to return home and rebuild their temple, and specifically ordered the sacred vessels of gold and silver to be returned to Jerusalem, restored to the very purpose from which Belshazzar had so casually and catastrophically diverted them. The king who mocked what was holy became, in the end, little more than a footnote of judgment in the very scripture he had defiled, while the God whose vessels he desecrated ensured that those same vessels would ultimately be carried home in honor. Daniel himself, remarkably, did not disappear from the biblical narrative after this dramatic night. Having survived the fall of one empire and the rise of another, he would go on to serve under the new Median and Persian administration as well, his integrity and faithfulness unbroken by the political upheaval swirling around him, a consistency of character that stands as its own quiet testimony across the many decades of his long and eventful life. If this exploration of Babylon's final night has stirred something within you, if it has served as a reminder to guard the sacred spaces of your own heart against the slow, quiet erosion of pride and forgetfulness, we invite you to reflect on it further. The writing may once have appeared on a wall in ancient Babylon, but its message has never stopped speaking across the centuries. It asks each of us, in every generation, whether the truth we have received will remain merely inherited, admired from a distance, or whether it will become something we ourselves have humbled our hearts before, something personally known rather than simply remembered. For those who continue to walk in pride, ignoring the mercy and warnings placed before them, the writing may indeed be upon the wall. But for those who turn, in humility, toward the God who numbers our days, weighs our hearts, and offers grace to the humble, there remains a very different kind of table, not a table of drunken defiance and impending judgment, but a table of grace, mercy, and restoration. This has been Heaven's Scroll. May his word remain written not merely upon plaster and stone, but upon the heart.